Hey everyone! I apologize for the lack of videos, as I've been pretty busy with a big move going on at my end. But now that that's done and over with, I figure I'd get back to creating some videos. I do have some big ones planned relatively soon, but I figure I'd make a few quick thoughts on a few recent releases I finally got a chance to catch up on. Starting with Top Gun Maverick. The highly anticipated sequel to Top Gun has been quite on the radar for a lot of people, considering this is one of the last movies to come out that was delayed countless times due to the pandemic. Even despite all the delays, this sequel hasn't been quite high on my radar to watch, partially because I didn't really grow up with the original Top Gun. I mean, I knew it was a thing, but I never fully watched it until around last year. And for what it is, it's a fun movie. It's very much a film that's a product of its time, but that's also part of the appeal. It's a neat little action movie of the 80s that serves as a good time capsule of the time period. So I wasn't quite sure to what they could do with a legacy sequel, though my interest of it peaked a lot more once I started hearing so many positive things about how the sequel ended up being one of the best second installments to any movie. A movie getting this much praise and recognition has to have something to it. And I'm glad to say that for the most part, Top Gun Maverick ends up being a massive improvement over the first film in practically every way. One way this movie does so is how it handles its characters, cause I say they're stronger here than they were in the original movie. I liked seeing more of Tom Cruise's Maverick trying to do the right thing in terms of his relationships that helped out the cast of the first film. It made the movie feel a little bit more personal, as this film mostly deals with an interpersonal conflict with Maverick on how he ends up being this great leader. The way the movie handles that does end up making the first film feel like it had a lot of merit to it. And while there are some callbacks to the original film, they don't really make it a selling point. This film doesn't act like a new Star Wars project where it just ends up doing, for the majority of the runtime, hey, remember how great the 80s was? As this movie does have a lot of good things that truly stand out on its own. Starting with possibly one of my favorite new additions in this entire movie, Jennifer Connelly. Now, this is coming from a place of a little bit of biasness, because she is admittedly one of my first major actress crushes as part of the big three, along with being an actress that I've always saw as very talented. But even taking that out of this, I honestly really liked her character here. The love interest in the original felt more like a standard 80s bombshell star. Connelly in this movie is a really likable bartender who always has this very welcoming personality and knows how to have a good time. I genuinely enjoyed her character and found her to be a pretty great love interest in this. Oh, and not really a spoiler, but I noticed in the background of her first scene she was in, we hear Let's Dance by David Bowie, which I'm considering that to be this film's subtle nod to Labyrinth. I'm sure it wasn't entirely intentional, but I feel like it's too easy of a coincidence for it not to be. The new cast of pilots also work well here. Not the most developed aside from Miles Teller's character, but they all have good camaraderie with one another. Though the other true highlight of Maverick in terms of the cast was how they handle Val Kilmer's character. The way they utilize him in this film was actually very touching, especially so shortly after gaining a newfound respect for Val after his recent A24 documentary. They carefully put his role in the movie in a very tasteful way, so I appreciate that big time. Though if we're talking what makes this sequel real good, is that as an action film, this is excellently crafted. The flight sequences in the first Top Gun were serviceable, but admittedly not anything to write home about, just standard. Here though, these are some of the most immersive dogfight flight sequences I've seen in any movie. The cinematography is so great and is enhanced even further when you know that most of what you're seeing was done practically. I can definitely see the praise it's been garnering with how fantastic most of these sequences are, making Maverick quite an essential summer blockbuster to see. I'll admit though, I did have one major issue that kept me from being absolutely in love with this movie. And it's admittedly a fault I also had with the first film as well. And that is, I wish that the main threat this movie deals with had a lot more of a presence to them. That is, we don't really get to know this film's antagonistic force they're up against. The entire film is just solely centered around the heroes, story and character-wise. In some ways, this isn't too much of an issue, as this film is centered more around the interpersonal conflict Maverick has with himself, and also learning to be a good leader. And I can also see this being beneficial, as it would be very easy to have the villains in this be something more cliche and stereotypical. The movie does have its focus set very hard on the perspective of our heroes, and it's done well, but without that feeling of the threat, it does feel kinda empty. Like, the enemies in this film to fight are just basic enemies and not much else. If it wasn't for that, this definitely would have been up there as one of the very best sequels. Even despite that, I found this to be a pretty great time. Top Gun Maverick is vastly entertaining and has a lot of craft to it, much better than the average revival film. Any film featuring Jennifer Connelly in a very likable role, along with an excellent use of We Don't Get Full Again by The Who, is worth your time. So take that for what it's worth. And I'm going to give Top Gun Maverick an 8 out of 10. The other movie I wanted to talk about real quick was the new Pixar movie, Lightyear. Now, Lightyear was a movie I was interested in, but not too hyped. I heard a lot of negativity surrounding this movie prior to coming out, with a lot of people feeling like it was unnecessary and needlessly complicated. Though that said, it is a different take on a spin-off title, I'll give it that. It's a Buzz Lightyear movie, but it's not about the character in the Toy Story movies, but who the character in the Toy Story movies is actually based on. A movie character, and it is said to be the explanation to why Andy loves Buzz Lightyear. An odd take for sure, and not to mention Buzz Lightyear isn't even voiced by Tim the Toolman Taylor in this, and instead is played by my good friend and artist of my avatars, Austin. He's instead voiced by Captain America star Lucas Lee.
I want to have his adopted babies.
Yeah, he may be Steve Rogers to most of y'all, but he'll always be Lucas Lee in my heart. Even with that in mind, and still no connections to the animated series from back in the day, I wasn't too negative on this movie. I'll admit, I was pretty interested in seeing what Pixar's take on a sci-fi action film would be, even if it does have a loose connection to their most iconic franchise. Now that I've seen the film, and went in with the most open mind as I can have, Lightyear is pretty alright. However, I'd be lying to myself if I didn't say that I found this movie to be a bit underwhelming. It's by no means a bad movie. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's kind of admirable in terms of how they handled this as a science fiction film. At first, it was a little grating at points, as sometimes the film makes a lot of callbacks to the Toy Story movies, with a couple of lines Buzz says here that he has said in the other movies. In some cases, I get it with certain catchphrases and scenarios that the real Buzz Lightyear would be in, but when they made him said,
"You're mocking me, aren't you?"
stuff like that felt a bit forced. Yet, the movie was mostly engaging in the first half for me, as when the film does become this interesting science fiction film, utilizing the concepts of time, it was pretty compelling. The film does use time as a central theme, and honestly, the absolute highlight of this movie was a montage sequence that was easily the biggest part that made this feel like a Pixar movie. I won't go into detail, but it felt like a legitimate good combination of both Interstellar and Up. It does set up for a really neat movie at first, but then as it goes on, it gets very standard. Not horrible, the animation as expected from Pixar is still incredibly well done, though it's mostly reserved in terms of set pieces. The film takes itself more seriously than the average Pixar movie, and in some ways it did work, making it feel more tonally consistent. The issue more so comes with that as the film goes on, you feel like maybe this is taken too straight. I mean, for a movie that's supposed to be the one that Andy sees as a kid, this should have been a lot more campy and in the vein of science fiction action adventure films of the 80s and 90s. Especially apparent when the 2D animated series also would have been nice to get a mention here. But there hasn't been any callbacks to that series at all in the Toy Story movies. At the very least, maybe the buzz regarding the 2D animated Lightyear series and TV movie could lead to the series being on Disney Plus at some point, as it's way overdue among a few other shows in the mix. Not to say that the movie is a complete bore. Aspects like Buzz himself aren't too bad, and Chris Evans does a good job replicating a lot of the mannerism Buzz Lightyear has in more subtle ways than expected. Buzz's main partner and her granddaughter are also pretty strong supporting characters, and they kind of help add to the heart of this movie and handling its themes of time. Plus, Socks was pretty fun. The most unbelievable thing about this movie is the fact that this film had the most successful toy of all time, and this character wasn't around at all in toy form in 1995. Either way, the rest of the cast is fine, but they feel kind of standard as they're basic comic relief characters with the weapons expert and the wisecracker. Oh, and as for Zurg, well, I don't want to say much in risk of spoilers, but it kind of didn't work for me. It's where the movie is kind of at its weakest. Where the conflict ultimately leads to is kind of interesting, and it does dive into the whole theme of moving on from the past and being happy with what has happened, but it's kind of glanced over in the grand scheme of things. Plus, the explanation for the real quote-unquote villain of this film is felt pretty rushed. There was an idea there, but it wasn't really built up to as well as it should. And maybe for as cliche as it is, the Toy Story 2 route for this character might have been the better option. It also heavily reminded me of a similar villain that appeared in the Lego Movie 2, but that movie was done way better than how this film handled its antagonist. Those elements kind of brought this movie down, which is a shame because there's a really good movie in here somewhere. With its great setup, I wish it became more exciting as it went on, as there was a little more to be desired here. The main movies I honestly compare it to in terms of quality is right in between The Black Cauldron and the duo of Atlantis and Treasure Planet. As in the same vein of those films, I can admire what the film is trying to be on its own conceptually, being a more serious and epic science fiction film made for kids. But much like those movies I just mentioned, it would have ended up better if it aimed for the full-fledged, more serious, ambitious science fiction project that it wants to be, instead of the movie that Disney wants it to be. To a point where it probably would have been better off if they made it its own original science fiction film instead of adding the Toy Story name to it. Like I said, it's far from a bad movie, as the stuff that made it feel like genuine Pixar and the stuff that made it a little bit more different for Pixar are done very well. But it makes me wish that the movie we got was stronger than it was. It's worth giving it a shot if you're really interested and if you happen to be a big Toy Story fan. But if you're looking for the next excellent Pixar movie, you might be better off going to Disney Plus to watch Turning Red if you still haven't yet. So take that for what it's worth. And I'm going to give Lightyear a 6 out of 10. So yeah, those were my thoughts on both of those movies. What did you think of either of these films if you've seen them yet? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all again next time. Later.
Get your Buzz Lightyear action figure and save a galaxy near you! Buzz Lightyear!
Available at all Al's Toy Bound outlets in the Tri-County area.